Oh, it takes a team. It takes a team. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. Welcome aboard. Just a reminder, it's a beautiful day, at least it was when I came in this morning, of the number of people it takes to get me up here on the podium. But they don't remind me to get rid of my lozenge. So I have to do that myself. Thank you all very much for being here. I did see Humaira with Reuters putting some blush on in the bathroom. I did see that. Do you know why? But do you know why? Because on occasion, cameras do face this first row or so. Well, it was not really in there. It was in the anteroom. It was in the anteroom, which has chairs and a couch. It's very fancy-ish.
Honey, I'll keep that in mind.
Oh, no.
You better be careful next time.
I will. I know you do not keep your sources or secrets to yourself. Well, you keep your sources to yourself, but not your secrets.
Very much to myself.
All right, yes, you do. Too much, so. Too much. All right, everybody, thank you. We do have a couple of announcements here. I want to begin to reiterate the words of President Trump and Secretary Rubio in condemning the horrific terrorist attack in Colorado on the Jewish community, who were raising awareness for the hostages still being held by Hamas. Since the beginning of Secretary Rubio's tenure as Secretary of State, his focus on visas and the State Department's role determining who is allowed into this country has often been mocked, derided, or dismissed. This heinous attack is a reminder that the decisions about who we let into this country and who we allow to stay is of vital national security and personal security importance to this country and of Americans everywhere. As Secretary Rubio notes about this attack, quote, all terrorists, their family members, and terrorist sympathizers here on a visa should know that under the Trump administration, we will find you, revoke your visas, and deport you. Also today, the State Department is taking steps to impose visa restrictions on several Central American government officials who are responsible for deals with the corrupt Cuban regime to import medical personnel in their forced labor scheme. As Secretary Rubio notes, these steps promote accountability for those who support and perpetuate these exploitive practices. The Cuban labor export program abuses the participants, enriches the corrupt Cuban regime, and deprives everyday Cubans of essential medical care that they desperately need in their homeland. Our goal is to support the Cuban people in their pursuit of freedom and dignity, all while promoting accountability for those who contribute to a forced labor scheme. By pursuing these visa restrictions, the U.S. is sending a clear message about our commitment to promoting human rights and respect for labor rights worldwide. We encourage other nations to join us in this effort, end quote. Further, we are closely monitoring Mount Etna's eruption yesterday. We are not aware of any U.S. citizens affected at this time, and we are monitoring the situation closely. We strongly encourage U.S. citizens in the affected area to monitor local news and follow the emergency instructions provided by local authorities. We will provide information to U.S. citizens in the area through the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program messages, our consulate websites, social media, and at travel.state.gov as necessary. This is also an important reminder for all Americans traveling to enroll in the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program at step.state.gov. That's step.state.gov. And that is what I have for you right now. Looking forward to your questions. Let me get this managed here as we move into the day with a number of issues I know on your plate. Sean Tandon.
Thanks. Can I start with Gaza?
Certainly.
I know that Caroline Levitt spoke to this a while ago, but yesterday Ambassador Huckabee in Israel made a statement saying that media reporting is incorrect in terms of saying that there are incidents. Today we had the Red Cross saying that 27 people were killed, and Israel saying that confirming that they opened fire at first as warning shots in their description of how it transpired. Does the U.S. have anything to say about the deaths today and what it means for the aid effort there?
Well, the first thing I'd like us to not do is conflate different episodes. the earlier Huckabee statement, of course, the ambassador in Jerusalem for Israel. There was a series of events that were fake news, that were debunked, that were reported, though, as having occurred. And then there is a situation where there were reportedly 27 casualties at a site today, and the IDF has noted that they are investigating. So I think that there is an important difference. It's important for us to recognize the difference, certainly in a war zone, but when there is news that is not true, for us to be able to point that out. But then also, as we appreciate the fact that the IDF is investigating the latest incident, and we'll be watching that report and investigation and keep you advised.
Well, can I follow up on that? I mean, you're not disputing the 27 casualties today, I mean, regardless of...
Well, clearly, the IDF is investigating a situation where there were casualties. So it's a number I can't confirm yet, but clearly we're going to get more information, and we'll be watching that and monitoring that closely.
Sure. But with the investigation, does this give any pause to thoughts about how this is running? There's criticism throughout of the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, the idea that it's not a humanitarian, not following humanitarian principles by having, for example, the Israeli military around there. Does this give any pause, any rethink about how this is going, considering you've seen?
Well, we wouldn't need, of course, the Israeli military as security. They wouldn't need to be there if Hamas would lay down their weapons and release all the hostages and the bodies that they're also holding. So let's not forget why this situation is maintained and is in the situation, the condition that we're in. It's important to not look at individual events in a vacuum in that regard, but also everyone has wanted food and aid to go through into Gaza. It is a war zone, and different kinds of decisions have to be made. People put their lives at risk to get the aid into those kinds of regions, and this is one of those cases. We'll find out through the IDF investigation what occurred, but the fact of the matter is, I think we are now at 7 million meals distributed to date. Now, obviously, we would like perfection. There is no perfection under any circumstance. We would like it to be even more, and they are going to be increasing, I believe, their sites, 4 more distribution sites that will include northern Gaza as well. So these are imperfect situations for catastrophic areas where the rest of the world has wanted this to be done. We have to try, and that's what they're doing. They're not only trying, they're succeeding in getting the meals distributed. And in the meantime, we're going to obviously be determining how that's working and how we can further improve, perhaps. And I would guess that they're going to, obviously, as the ones on the ground, make a determination about how to do this and refine it as we go on. Yeah, Andrea.
Let me just follow up on that, because no one should jump to conclusions. We all have reporters on the ground. Israel has not let U.S.-based reporters in, but we have partners there and staff members there who have been courageously there since October 7th doing this job. And if, unlike other war zones in Ukraine, in Iraq, and elsewhere where U.S. reporters have always been in Vietnam, this is the first conflict where we have not been able to go in except with IDF escorts for particular photo opportunities. So that is one fact. But the ambassador, the chief diplomatic representative of the United States, ascribed a collective guilt to what he said was not just misleading reports in the fog of war. We all know what happens in some instances, and we're not sure of these cases. But to suggest that the press reports fostered anti-Semitism, which led to the death of the 2 embassy people here in Washington and to other anti-Semitic attacks in this country, is hyperbole beyond what is normal diplomatic practice. And as a journalist and as a member of this press corps, I think it's deeply offensive for someone who has...
Well, I don't speak for Ambassador Huckabee. I understand, Andrea. I know. I understand. And I understand the depth of your work and the work... Andrea, I understand your work, the depth of your work, the work of people who cover war, and the dangers that exist. I don't speak for Ambassador Huckabee. I'm not going to parse what he has said, but what I can tell you is that inevitably, as we have all watched, the kind of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism that has been promulgated through media has been nonstop, even after October 7th, and that if you weren't involved in that and others who are not involved in that, that's not who he's speaking about. I would argue that it would be naive to suggest that the Jew hatred that, whether it's through social media, through fake news, through the rhetoric regarding Israel, through the years, has not developed or perpetuated anti-Semitism. It's naive or mistaken. I'll give you that word. I think it's obvious that these things don't happen in a vacuum, and that the rhetoric against Jews for 2,000 years has been nonstop and quite blunt. And it hasn't stopped. And the way the world has responded recently in the 21st century to the attack on Jews, including what's been going on at American universities, has been obscene. So I think we should allow individuals to have their opinions about what has contributed to the murder of 2 Jews in Washington, D.C., who are simply enjoying a night out, who instead of being married in the next few months had to be buried. I think that this is not the argument, but it is the story, in that we are fighting a great deal with these stories about who's responsible, the focus on Israel, the nature of who's been attacking in that region, the responsibility of Iran, that we get food in, that's not good enough. What happens with Israelis and what they say is not good enough. What the president said, I'll reiterate here, is that we have got to move past all of this. There has to be new ideas. We have to end this circle, and that's what we're doing here. So when we think about this, I think the ambassador, our ambassador to Israel, has every right and will speak his mind, as he is the ambassador to that important state that is constantly under attack, and it is a reasonable understanding of what has affected people worldwide, which is a rhetoric that has normalized the hatred of Jews and in some cases romanticized it. And we have to stand up against it, and we will, but I'm not going to condemn him for that.
Can I follow up on the distribution of food, though? Because
certainly.
Let me just say that there is widespread criticism and actually self-criticism by the consulting group that was supporting the foundation, which is backed out of it, that the distribution system was not as professional as either the UN, or the World Food Program and other people who are used to working in this area, and that there should have been more distribution points where people would not have been told to line up. And
Andrea, you know what? But these questions now, these are critiques of an environment that we've talked about regularly every day.
But let me just say,
every time I'm up here, it is this critique of. I say 7 million meals have been distributed, but you know it would have been, but not for you. It should have been those guys over there or these people over here. Over the last 3 years with the UN or the World Food Program, no one has distributed 7 million meals to Gaza.
Many hundreds of thousands of people in Israel, as well as the Hamas, the families of the people being held by Hamas, are protesting this food decision. The former defense minister criticized these decisions. There is plenty of internal.
Well, I'm sorry, Andrea. I understand. I understand. I don't think any of us are going to be protesting 7 million meals being distributed. When we think about what the story is, there in that region and in general with everything that happens, someone's not going to be happy. Someone's going to think it could have been done a better way, and yet it wasn't being done. It wasn't being done. This managed to be done. It is continuing on. I want as many meals to be distributed as possible. They seem to be doing that, and I understand everyone has their opinion, but this is not a debate about who would have had the better idea. This is what's happening, and the meals are being distributed. And I thought, after 3 months of being harangued in this room by many of you about don't you care about the starving Gazans, 7 million meals, and now we're being harangued about it's not by the right people. We have to move on from that. Yes, sir.
I'd like to just follow up on your opening, if I could.
Certainly.
You said about the Boulder terrorist suspects that Secretary Rubio has said, all terrorists, their family members, and terrorist sympathizers here on a visa should know that under the Trump administration, we will find you, revoke your visas, and deport you. The terrorist suspects' family members are in ICE custody now. Have their visas also been revoked by state?
I will not speak to the action taken for these individuals, so I can't confirm or deny that. I would say now, of course, this is in ICE's realm and perhaps also in DHS, and you should ask them about the next steps that they're taking and what will happen to the family in this regard.
The revocation of the visas in State Departments.
Well, but as I said when I opened, I'm not going to address that, whether that's occurred or not.
Sorry.
Oh, yes, Matt, please. Matt Lee.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask.
Don't be sorry. You're never sorry. But that's all right. Neither am I.
I want to ask one question about Gaza, but first,
Yes.
Is there paper coming out on this Cuba, or the Latin America Cuban doctors?
Yes, there is. As a matter of fact,
Oh, okay, 'cause
it should.
missed it,
I think this should already be out. It should already be out.
Oh.
So you will have a statement from the secretary regarding the so-called Cuban doctors forced labor framework. I would suspect we'll also see a tweet. Might want to keep an eye on the secretary's accounts. But yes, you will have a more extensive statement.
But I have really poor service in here, so I.
It's all right.
See it. I just back on to what Andrea was talking about. So it is still correct that the GHF, this foundation, there is no U.S. involvement in it. There's no U.S. personnel involved or working for it. That is correct, right?
I have said, I think we've all been saying that, in fact, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is an independent organization. It does not receive U.S. government funding.
Right.
Nevertheless, we are constantly looking, of course, for creative solutions to get aid into Gaza without.
Right, but
yes.
there aren't any U.S. officials working.
There's
for
the Gaza. It does not receive U.S. government funding.
Right, but there aren't any U.S. officials working for it.
It does not receive U.S. government funding. That's the last time I'll repeat that sentence.
Okay, so how do
All right.
you know then that all these reports are wrong if you don't have people on the ground?
Well, it's amazing how there are
I'm not
people on
saying
there.
they're right.
I would say that also. It's. I don't think we need someone whom you know personally or is assigned to you to be in a region to understand what's happened on the ground. It's the State Department, it's the United States government, it's the ambassador in Israel, and I think that there's a point where there has to be recognition that we have a sense, and we know, more than a sense, that we know what's happening on the ground. All right, Nadia.
Thank you, Tammy. I want to address the high number of civilian casualties in Gaza. On average, 80 to 100 people, mainly women and children, are killed. Your predecessor defended Israel policy for years, but now that he's out of government, he said that basically he believes that Israel is engaged in some aspect of war crimes. Does this administration share this point of view, regardless of what Hamas has did, and it's just completely separate of what's happening in Gaza now, considering the incidents, but the high numbers of civilians being killed every single day, including children who've been
I would caution that very often the media carries the reports that come from Hamas. And I would I think to look at those numbers with some suspicion. On someone's opinion about what Israel is or is not doing, everyone has an opinion, and everyone has the right to express that opinion, but I'm not going to comment on what someone else thinks is going on elsewhere. Yes, pink jacket.
I actually have a question that was sent from a fellow journalist, and I promise I'll
And
ask
tell me
if
your
I
name
can
and your outlet again.
Rima with Al-Arabi TV.
Okay, hi.
The question is this. Today, an article from the media line reported that the United States is considering imposing visa and trade sanctions on Chile due to the Chilean government's decision to hold weapon purchase from Israel. Additionally, the Chilean government confirmed that Mr. Rubio reached out last Friday to express his concern regarding the relationship between Chile and Israel. Can you confirm the details of the call and provide information on whether the U.S. is evaluating these sanctions?
Well, we have a tendency to not remark on anonymous comments of things that may or may not have happened. So I can have them take back questions about the situation with Chile, but we'll get that to you later.
And
yes, sir. If it's something that I can actually comment on, and not an anonymous comment
No.
presented by someone else to you.
Who is going to be after Morgan Ortagus, the envoy to Lebanon? And the reason I'm asking is because I'm going to be there next week. So I just
Right. I'm not going to speak on personnel here or decisions that will be made by our special envoy. Yes, sir.
Just on the aid provision to Gaza. I mean, you'd said that there was a sense that people were criticising this because it was the wrong people doing it. Isn't it more about the mechanism that's been used? And the UN and all the major aid agencies have warned that if this kind of system was used, which places hungry and desperate people in very close proximity to Israeli troops who have previously used lethal force for crowd control, that situation is extremely dangerous. And they'd also said, there are risks for a whole load of other reasons as well. But they were warning for weeks, and that's why they didn't want to get involved in this, because it breaches all of the decades of expertise on delivering aid neutrally in a war zone to get to civilians, and that being the priority, to get to the maximum number of civilians. I mean, do you heed any of that advice or warning now, given what's happened over the last 48 hours?
This is not our project. It is something that I think everyone's been and will be optimistic about. I like the idea that 7 million meals have been distributed. So, and then there is criticism that comes in. I would suggest that because it's a war zone, there was never going to be a perfect dynamic, except there was a ceasefire. And we were also moving in food and aid during the ceasefire. And then Hamas decided that, no, that's not good enough anymore, and started up again. So, our commitment isn't just because in good times or because it's easy or because it's safe. We've been working hard to try to have a framework and asking people for new ideas about how to get this done, because those known entities and known factors and known people have been unable to do anything. So when we can wax lyrically about the past and people have better ideas and we're afraid of this. This is, yes, moving into a war zone run by a terrorist group where you need the defense of people with guns because it's a war zone and they indiscriminately kill people and they're still holding hostages. But you want to get food in there, and we've got to do it. And so I think that there's a framework of, yes, either the well-known stalwart entities that warned that you don't need to be warned, it's a war zone. We know there's going to be some issues. But that should not do this. It's been done. It's happening. It is, yes, dynamics are dangerous, and there are 7 million meals that have been distributed. I can't stress enough that is the story, and that will always be the story. And in the meantime, hopefully things will be refined and people learn. Nobody wants this environment. And we wouldn't have it if Hamas actually behaved like human beings. Humaira, yes.
Clarify on one, which is one
certainly.
thing you said earlier, which you said that Israeli troops wouldn't have to be there if Hamas surrendered. But my understanding is that's not the position, because we've had very senior ministers in the Israeli government say that the objective here now is to control and occupy the area, to clear it, and to basically to build.
Well, I'm sure. Yes, I see the newsletters and I see the magazines and the scholarly discussions about what Israel's really doing or not doing. All I know is that prior to this delivery of 7 million meals, the questions were, when are you going to get food into Gaza? It's happened. And now we can surmise and wonder and critique and point to others. But I think the story remains that this is the only way that has worked and that has been engaged with. And it's nice to sit in an air-conditioned office and critique those who are on the ground distributing meals. But that is going to remain the focus. Humaira, let's try again.
Hi, Tammy. I do have a question about this, but then I'm going to move on to Iran and Ukraine.
Of course.
Just to get this from you, in light of everything we've discussed here and in your answer to Matt, you have emphasized that U.S. does not fund this effort. But the United States, in light of everything that's happened over the past couple of days, will continue supporting this effort. Is that right?
Oh, well, here's what I know, again, because it's not...
for an alternative?
See, I love you frame a question where it's important to ask the question, but it's also, that I'm not going to speculate on decisions that are made not only not by people here, but by people elsewhere, not in the State Department. So I can't speak to what is their decision-making, what's going to affect that decision-making, but it's not a decision the State Department's making. I can't answer that first question, that it's going to continue on no matter. I can't answer that kind of a question.
No, as in, like, the administration has been very supportive of this effort. Are you going to keep supporting
yes,
this effort,
we've been vocally supportive, like as one would hope, about the nature of the structure of getting food in, and so far, of course, because it's imperfect, because of the arena in which it's in, that 7 million meals have been distributed. I'm impressed with that number. I hope other people are as well.
Okay. On Iran, are you able to tell us, like, the latest on the talks after there's been so much reporting about the U.S. proposal, which is effectively allowing Iran, on a limited basis, for low-level uranium enrichment for a TBD period of time? Is there going to be a new round of talks anytime soon?
Well, you did see the President Trump tweet, didn't you?
Yes, but I didn't think that would completely negate the reporting.
I appreciate that. I think that's the biggest guffaw I've had here. The thing that matters when it comes to American policy and what's happening is what President Trump thinks and says. This is the Trump administration. It is sometimes an unusual communication structure, as we've learned here in this very room. But the fact is, President Trump tweeted that there is going to be no uranium enrichment. Does the President of the United States, not just any president, but Donald Trump, does his opinion that he makes public trump news media reports? I think so.
No,
you know better than that.
No, as in the whole sticking point here is to try to come up with some sort of a formula that's going to be acceptable.
Well, that's a very different thing than what you just noted. So let me just make sure it's clear. The President has made clear and is the final word, obviously, and has been literally the final word in this regard, there will be no uranium enrichment. Now, if you're seeing reports about what the deal is, obviously that's incorrect. The President leads this. The President guides this. It is his guiding hand. It is the American people are happy with that. They elected him for his expertise and his focus. So President Trump's, not quite sure where you would think where President Trump's statement would not be the final dynamic here, and that, in fact, maybe reports could be wrong.
That's not what I said.
All right.
So are you saying that there was no proposal verbally or
I'm not going to comment
to the Iranians?
I'm not going to comment on how the negotiations,
enrichment.
Humaira, I'm not going to comment on the process of negotiations. We've been as clear as we can with the various negotiations, the discussions that have been going on over a period of weeks, and there's been readouts put on those, and some elements of some details, but you can't discuss the nature of what a negotiation is because there's many elements involved and many different intentions involved, and the end result we won't know until it's over. So I'm not going to say if there was a submission or what the details were. What I do know that is public and blunt is the President of the United States statement about what it won't be, and that is the one thing we know at this point. All right, yes, sir.
On Iran, any idea about the next round of talks, when and where it will happen?
No.
And the other question, Senator Schumer yesterday accused the president on folding on Iran and said that the administration is getting ready to sign a secretive side deal with Iran. Any comments on this?
No. What I can say, though, of course, is that the maximum pressure campaign on Iran remains in full force. All right? Yes, ma'am.
Just following up on Humaira's question on Iran, would you say that optimism that was expressed by the president last week is still there? He seemed very positive about prospects. Do you still see them moving forward, or are they kind of a standstill?
There is no one's happy when people are killed. This has been the driving force of his decisions since January 20th and before, is to save people's lives and to be a peacemaker and to get these horrible things to end. So, of course, all of us are affected by that. At the same time, 7 million meals.
Sorry, Iran. Tammy.
Oh, Iran.
Yeah.
All right, well, his optimism on that is true as well. I mean, you've got.
You still
I
believe
think.
they're
Well,
moving forward at pace?
his actions and his statements are based in the nature of the conversations that he knows are being had, and his understanding of why people are doing what they're doing and what we can do as a nation to mitigate that. And he has been very vocal on his optimism in that regard as well. I have not heard anything to counter that, but again, I'm not in those rooms, and I'm not going to read his mind. I do know that these people have been at the table because of the nature of the power of his influence and the power of the United States. He wouldn't be doing something that he didn't think he could accomplish. And I think that is informed in part by his optimism.
And then quickly on visas, are the student and exchange visas still on hold? And do you have an estimate of how much of a backlog this has now caused?
All right.
The appointments for
Yes. There is going to be, I can tell you there'll be more on this but before the end of the week. The original cable indicated it was going to be a matter of days. And I think that this is a sense of making sure that embassies and consulates are prepared to make sure that all the steps that are needed are able to be taken, and just making sure that things were in order, that this is not a never-ending dynamic, and we are looking at, again, an update in a matter of days in that regard as well.
And any sense of the backlog that this has caused?
Well, no appointments were canceled. There were people have been encouraged and continue to be encouraged to. There's two steps, right? You apply, but then you have to have an interview, and so inevitably no appointments were, canceled or eliminated from availability. I think that when this returns, we're going to see that appointments are going to be able to be made. It's not like it's a time block that can't be returned, that days can't be returned. And I think that once this is done and it's back online, it'll go pretty quickly. All right. Yes?
Thank you. Just to follow up on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, you mentioned that the IDF is looking into investigating the incident that happened most recently out of several incidents of violence. You highlighted that they're succeeding in getting millions of meals distributed, and you said that in the meantime we're going to obviously be determining how that's working and how we can further improve this. And as my colleagues have pointed out, the U.S. government is very vocal about supporting this as a creative process and trying to improve a very dire situation on the ground.
Sure.
Do you have anything to say about how this process could be improved?
No. There are people more knowledgeable than me, obviously, who are on the ground, who do this for a living, who are experts. I have no comment. No one here is going to have a comment or advice on how things should move. It's just the opposite. I spent 25 years in media doing exactly what you're asking. And it's a different language, but I'm here to just at least certainly try to get the details to you without opining or making suggestions. Yes, sir.
Could I just follow up on one?
Sure, one more.
Do you agree that the area of improvement would involve something to do with the security situation and reducing?
I will not speculate or give advice or muse on any aspect of that issue or pretty much any other.
Can I have one?
All right, yes, sir. No, we're going to move on here. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Thank you, Tommy. I will stay in Gaza, but in a different aspect. Lately, in the last couple of days, there was some developments in the negotiations toward reaching a ceasefire. There was a new U.S. proposal. Hamas wanted to enter some changes to it. It was not acceptable by the U.S. Yesterday, Hamas announced that it's willing to enter a non-direct negotiation with Israel to reach a framework that will lead to a ceasefire. Are you supportive of this?
Well, I'm here to tell you what we know at this point. I'm not going to discuss something that is either in the midst of something being discussed with a foreign country. It's not my position to do that. At the same time, of course, we've made it clear that Hamas has to stop acting recklessly. We certainly can note that. And as S.E. Witkoff had noted, Hamas's recent response to the existing offer was totally unacceptable and only takes us backward. So, these are the people on the ground who will make those kinds of decisions, but I'm not going to comment on something that is still speculative. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Tanya. I want to move to Ukraine, if I may. I want to get your reflection.
Yes, please. Let's do that.
The events of past couple of days and also next 2 days. I know that the Ukrainian delegation is in town. I understand they were in this building this morning. We are in the second week of the president's latest 2 weeks deadline, if you want. And the Ukrainians said that yesterday they met with the Russians, and whatever they put on the table, which was the last minute, they didn't have time to respond. Is it your concern that they're slow walking the process, and what do you expect from the talks in the next 2 weeks?
Well, I would disagree with your characterization that it's the latest 2 weeks deadline. Right? Is that what you meant? There is again a commitment to not have this go on for months or to have meetings about meetings. It's not going to go on for a year. The president and the secretary want an accomplishment and a deadline. They know what can be accomplished, and sometimes, remarkably, in negotiations, you have some progress, and then things move forward. Right? Then you actually can make a difference, and you're somewhat flexible in being able to make it work. So I think that it is has to be taken within that framework. As far as the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, we did not have a delegation there. I think we are certainly reading a lot of things in the media, but as the president has said and as the secretary has noted as well, this has now got to be between the parties. And there's some discussion of the exchange of wounded prisoners and very young prisoners, and we can read that in the news. But again, we do look at what people do, not what they say.
According to media reports, the Russian side, they are beefing up their demands. Not only they cover Ukraine, they also talk about Georgia, Moldova, and their NATO aspirations. Does the United States have any position on that?
Well, we've seen those reports. He's asking about Georgia and Moldova, the support of additional countries, et cetera. We've seen those reports, and we continue to support direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. We, of course, have said repeatedly there's no military solution to this conflict, and the president supports, though, any mechanism that leads to a just, durable, and lasting peace. Any mechanism, but we'll have to see where that plays out. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Tammy. 2 questions for you. Number one, Career Ambassador David Hale met today with the Lebanese Prime Minister. Was Ambassador Hale there in his capacity, the State Department, or in a private capacity?
I'm going to have to take that back and get that back to you.
Second topic.
Yes.
The French presidential advisors spoke with their Israeli counterparts today, said they would not be moving forward with unilateral recognition of the Palestinian state at the upcoming UN two-state solution conference. I'm trying to get a sense of the American posture and policy toward this upcoming conference, because obviously the Trump administration is not a proponent of moving forward with a two-state solution at the moment. Is it to take a hammer to this conference? Is it to work within the contours and try to find like a bridging solution with everybody? I mean, what is the approach to this conference from the State Department?
Well, I would consider that a discussion of a diplomatic strategy, or certainly plans that one would have or not have when we're discussing something as serious as this. It's good news if what you indicate is correct, that the French have backed away from what their plans are. But this is Israel. Obviously, you can also check with Israel when it comes to their position in this regard. But I won't discuss from this podium what our plans would be at the UN or at any other conference. Yes, sir, at the end.
Me? Sorry.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Ryan from Bloomberg, and new to the room.
Terrific.
Just back to Gaza. There's been a shift in tone in some European countries when it comes to Israel, notably in Germany, whose chancellor has said that the situation in Gaza could no longer be justified by a fight against Hamas terrorism. Some countries like UK and France are considering trade sanctions and restrictions on arms sales. Are you seeing a split with the U.S. when it comes to this, and do you have a message for your European allies?
No, I have no comment on that. All right. We'll talk to you in the blue jacket, please.
Thank you, Tammy, very much. Yeah. Election on South Korea. As an ally of South Korea, what does the United States view about this Korean presidential election? And do you think the president elected in this election will be able to improve U.S. and South Korea relations? Thank you.
Yeah, so there's an election. We are waiting for its certification, and we will certainly occurs. All right. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Karen. Two questions. First, on Gaza and West Bank. Where does the Trump administration stand when it comes to the two-state solution? Is it still on their radar, on this administration radar, or it's not?
Well, what we are focused on, obviously, is a ceasefire so that this wholesale terrorist slaughter of innocent people can finally, for once in a generation, come to a complete and total stop. But I would like to, we've discussed the Gaza situation quite regularly here, so let's, is that my microphone or someone else's microphone that is I'm getting feedback on?
One more?
There is an audio problem, so let's make sure the mics are down unless someone is speaking.
One more.
Gotcha. All right.
One more?
Well, if you're going to move on from Gaza, there are a host of other subjects, and I'm having to go soon, and we've not touched on a number of things.
Just one more.
So one more.
Yeah, thank you. How does the Trump administration assess the latest efforts from the interim government in Syria?
All right. So Syria, we, of course, our asks of the Syrian government have not changed. We are, of course, continuing to support. Ambassador Barak is there as our lead in that regard, working with making sure that that government has a chance to succeed. We've taken actions here, of course, to make sure that there are waivers when it comes to sanctions, allowing a number of other issues to be able to be implemented, including memorandums of understanding regarding electricity and the basic functional aspects of life, which, of course, is importance there. So I think that we're in a wait and see with an effort that we've made to make sure they have the greatest chance to succeed within a continuing expectation of making sure that every Syrian is involved in this process, and that terrorism is something, and ISIS in particular, is something that is continued to be defeated in that region. So it is so far, again, with Ambassador Barak, who's got a great Twitter account, or I should say X. And he's very prolific in his statements and very open and transparent. And you'll see there the fact that things are moving along. But, of course, we watch with the, I think, correct amount of expectation and seriousness about what's possible. All right. All right, so now, other than Gaza, more on Syria? All right.
Questions on Syria, and I want to know your comment or assessment about the recent negotiations between the Kurdish.
The Kurdish?
The Kurdish-led administration negotiation with the Syrian interim government. The Kurds continue to emphasize the importance of preserving their autonomous administration in Rojava, northeast Syria.
Right.
Does the United States support this approach? And the second question, there have been reports suggesting that the U.S. has given its tacit approval to the Syrian interim government to retain custody of the foreign fighters and potentially integrate them into their defense structure. These claims have gained traction following the recent visit of the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, to Damascus.
All right, so let me answer this because we're running out of time. The first question we've discussed, certainly even when the Kurds were here, and the nature of our awareness regarding the energy issues, et cetera. So I'm not going to be repeating that. If there's anything new, can we take it back and see if there's anything new or a new development regarding the Kurds in that regard? But and that's regarding, of course, Iraq. But I think regarding the military bases and the foreign fighters. So our asks of the Syrian government have not changed in that regard. During, I guess, as Ambassador Barak noted in Damascus, we are clear about the challenges facing the Syrian government as they take concrete steps toward the president's request in building a secure and stable Syria. And the ambassador stressed that transparency is of utmost importance as the Syrian government develops a plan in the days ahead. I would leave it at that, and the fact that also referring you to the DOD when it comes to issues regarding bases, et cetera. But I think that remembering that our asks of the new Syrian government have not changed, and that we are watching their process and expecting transparency about the choices they make and how they make them. That's about as clear as unclearly clear as I can be. All right, we'll leave it with you.
Thanks what? Apparently, a security alert went out yesterday from the U.S. mission to Mexico, warning Americans to use caution when using dating apps in various locations.
I think that alert should probably be global. I don't know about.
Some people are getting kidnapped and held for ransom.
Well,
is there any additional information or warning you can provide?
I don't. We can check on the dating apps these days, and we worry about kids online and everything that goes on. It's something that I'm not read into enough to even riff about. But it's if that is occurring, it's a serious dynamic. People should, in fact, be aware of that wherever they are when it comes to meeting strangers using the internet. All right, that's it. I'm glad we ended on that point. All right, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.